So, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Teresa Gil. Teresa, welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
All right. So Teresa has been a psychotherapist, professor, and trainer for more than 25 years. She has a private practice working with women dealing with recovery from child abuse and trauma. Teresa is a full professor and teaches general psychology, abnormal psychology, child psychology, and psychology of women. She's also taught courses in both social work and sociology. She works as a trainer and consultant in human service settings, and has developed and facilitated dozens of clinical trainings on pertinent therapeutic issues. All right, Teresa, awesome to have you here. It's really an honor to have someone with your experience on this podcast. Before we get going, though, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
That's a good question, because originally I'm from Queens.
Nice. That's where I'm from.
Oh,
yes.
Flushing for Queens.
Nice. Nice.
Where are you from in Queens?
Well, originally I was born in Manhattan and then moved to Queens, Jamaica States.
Oh, okay. So not too far from Main Street.
Not too far.
No.
But awesome. All right, go. I'm sorry.
So the accent is definitely Queens, and I haven't been able to get rid of it. And although I've tried, but I'm now in Albany, New York, which is about 2.5 hours north of New York City. It's the capital.
So you've been there all your life?
I've been there since I was like 24.
Okay. Okay. All right. Awesome. All right. Well, let's jump in here. As we were talking before we started, that's the goal here, to dig in and find out how the heck you got into this field. Go.
Well, I think I got into the field because my parents were very much involved. My dad was a social worker. He was an immigrant from Venezuela, and he worked in East Harlem as a community organizer. He also worked with gangs, and he worked with families. So he did social work. Okay. Well, I believe it was from my parents. And my dad was from Venezuela, where he came to the United States as an immigrant, as a child. And as an adult, he worked with the gangs. He was the Hispanic population. He worked with gangs, he worked with families, he worked with community organizing and tenant organizing in East Harlem. And my mother was also involved in social justice issues. She worked with Cesar Chavez, with the farm workers. Oh. She worked for the anti-Vietnam War, and she also helped started Earth Day. And so she was very politically involved. And I mean, I was a little puppy. I was only 3 or 4 years old when she would take me to marches or take me to demonstrations. There was the conversations at our breakfast table. She was also involved in the Catholic worker movement with Dorothy Day. And my aunt was the liaison for Mother Teresa and has written a number of books about Mother Teresa. So I was kind of involved with people who were involved in social justice issues and people involved in working with those that were disenfranchised. And so social work was just, I think it's cellular, and it was the right place to be for me.
Awesome.
And after 35 years, I still think it is the absolute right place for me to be.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, that's inspiring. Like you said, it's cellular. That's who you are. Okay, so you're surrounded by this growing up. Lead us through the steps of what happened next for you.
Well, I went into psychology. And then after I got my bachelor's in psychology, I made it to the mountaintop, so to speak. I realized that you really can't do much with a bachelor's in psychology, and I needed to take it further. I didn't quite know whether I wanted to go into psychology, go into social work, go into law, but I was really clear that I wanted to work with people, and there was no way that I was going to be at a desk job 9 to 5. I was eventually encouraged to go into the MSW program, which is what I did. And I've been happy with that decision all my life. And it's opened a lot of doors for me. It's opened the doors to be a therapist. It's opened the doors to be a trainer. It's opened doors to be a teacher.
Okay.
Eventually, I got my Ph.D. in that too.
So where does this interest in working with women who've been sexually abused come into play?
So it's interesting because my first job was working in a prevention program that did home-based family therapy. And it was long hours. You work at night because you have to be available for clients, and they work during the day. It's low pay. And many of these families have intergenerational abuse. Now, the women that I was working with were court ordered. So they were court ordered and mandated to receive services. Most of them were single moms. Most of them were young moms, and most of them had very little support systems, if no support system at all, and a history of abuse. So that was my first entry into working with survivor moms. But 3 years after working at the prevention program, there was a group of women, there were 8 women who were child sexual abuse survivors. And they were in an agency, and they had a therapist, but the agency lost their funding. And they lost the ability to continue their group with the therapist that they had and in the agency that they had, but they decided they wanted to stay together. So they found a community agency that allowed them to have a free space on Tuesday nights.
Wow.
Then they went to look for a therapist, and they interviewed 5 therapists. And I was one of the therapists they interviewed.
Wow.
And so I got the job.
Let me just pause for a second. So where are you now within your training at this point?
3 years in prevention.
Okay.
And the training that I got there was in Bowen family systems training.
Okay.
So looking at intergenerational trauma. But mostly my job here in that agency was to stabilize the family so that the children could stay at home, or that the children could come back home and reestablish a relationship within the context of the family. So we never really looked, even though I knew my clients were survivors of trauma, there wasn't really room to do that kind of introspection and that kind of work. So my first introduction to really working seriously with trauma survivors and sexual abuse survivors came from being hired by that group. Mm. But I have to tell you, it's kind of impressive that these group of women decided that they weren't going to be shut down, right, that healing was important to them, and they wanted to stay together, enough so that they hired their own therapist.
Right.
But which kind of changes, because usually what therapists do is clients come to them. Uh-huh. So the differential was a little bit different. So I went out and I hired a supervisor immediately that was trained in group work and that was trained with working with trauma.
Okay. Now let me hold on. You're saying a lot of stuff. I want to just make sure we track this, because this is good stuff for our listeners. So you're working with these women. You're realizing the trauma. How was this for you? I mean, how did this impact you? How did this affect you, both professionally and personally?
The women in the group?
Working with trauma per se through these women.
To be honest with you, I was overwhelmed. I was really naive. And, I was one of those people, because I worked in a BSW program, and we have all these little 18-year-olds that come in and say, I want to be a social worker because I want to help people. Mm-hmm. You don't really know what that means until you're in the field. And I was kind of a little naive, thinking that I was going to go in and help people. But the stories that came up and the horrific stories that came up and the emotions that followed those stories, or the incapacitation that happened sometimes to these women when they were in the middle of managing the trauma or they were triggered. I didn't have the skills for that. And, I was thinking that how, when I was in the MSW program, I got good grades. I wrote papers on sexual abuse. I got A's on them, but the knowledge and the skill is very different.
Now let's break it down there. What, for our listeners here, you said you were overwhelmed, and of course, most of us are, but what do you feel, what skill even do you feel that you wished you'd had at that point that you didn't have?
Well, I eventually went into a training group, and the training group taught bioenergetics, transactional analysis, and inner child work. So my supervisor ran a group for therapists to train in those modalities. And that was the most helpful to me as a trauma therapist, because I got to work on my own issues with a group of other therapists, because the training was working on your own issues. During the week, you would do reading, you would get the knowledge. But when you met weekly, you would apply that knowledge to one another. And so I became, from that point, someone who was knowledgeable to someone who was skillful.
Wow. Now, give us a little.
And then I wasn't so afraid when strong feelings came up of automatically in the middle of group, a woman had a rageful outburst. I think what I did have is that I could maintain a sense of calm when things got very emotional.
And you feel that training helped you, that group?
I think I came into the world like that.
Okay.
I came into therapy being able to do that.
Uh-huh.
And that might have been an outgrowth of being the middle of 9. But, and my parents reflected that too with their children. So I had that modeled for me. Mm-hmm. And I think that skill was probably critical for me to get through times where I felt overwhelmed and wasn't clear how to manage or intervene when somebody was having, let's say, a memory in the middle of the group, or was having very strong feelings, and how to contain that.
You said you got into that training group where you were being taught inner child as well as transactional analysis. Give us just a thumbnail of what transactional analysis is or does.
Well, transactional analysis, what it does is it looks at the parent, the critical parent in you, the child in you, and the adult. And that inside any experience that we may go through, there's going to be a voice that comes from one of those places. And the idea is to be able to separate the adult voice from the child's voice, from the critical parent voice. And sometimes it means that there'll be 3 chairs in the room, and you sit on each chair, because each of those are an aspect of yourself. And you get to explore those parts of yourself as you get to also talk to them and reason with them and find out what the belief systems are that make them think or feel that way, so that there can be shifts and we can move forward.
I love that. All right. So you're working with this woman, you're simultaneously getting this training.
Yes.
Okay. So continue on. How are things unfolding for you, et cetera?
My supervisor was really brilliant. And so I met with him weekly. I talked with him about, the group process. I talked with him about what was happening with clients. And he had given me skills and things to say, real concrete things to say and to address. And, but also I learned that in the training that I was doing with other therapists. So when you watch it unfold in your own work for yourself and with your colleagues, then all of a sudden becomes a natural way and it becomes automatic. You don't have to think about it as much.
How do you feel you changed as you gained more skill, techniques, et cetera? How do you feel you changed as a therapist as you continued working with these women?
They changed me. I learned a lot from them. And that's kind of the paradox of being a therapist, is that you go in there thinking naively that you're going to help them. But in the relationship, there's transformation on both sides. I learned how children get hurt. And I learned what children need. And I learned what's important to be in a relationship with other people. So by learning how people get hurt, I learned what not to do to be hurtful to people.
Okay, let's break that down. That's beautiful. Break it down. Can you get more specific?
So one particular client, really low self-esteem, it would be considered a small T trauma, which I don't really like the small T, big T. But in that her mother wasn't emotionally available. Her father was a salesman. He was gone for weeks at a time. And when she came home, her mother was tired and she was by herself. She had to fend for herself in terms of, doing her homework, getting her clothes ready, making supper for herself. Her mother was probably also clinically depressed. And so when we did inner child work, and she was able to cry about what those experiences were and being on the couch alone, and asking her what her little one needed, and her saying that I needed someone to sit with me. I needed someone to tell me I was going to be okay. I needed someone to talk with me about my day. That told me to make sure that I'm present for my daughter, that I sit with her, that I talk to her about what her day was like, and that I take cues from my daughter in order to be attuned. So what I find a lot with mothers is that mothers will say that they're attached to their kids. I work with a lot of mothers who say, I love my kids. Everything I do is for my children, but they're not attuned to them. So attuned is something that is almost psychic. It's almost spiritual. Attuned is knowing when, your child all of a sudden slumps down, or they're not making eye contact, or they go into collapse, or they're in fight flight and they're not themselves, or a shift happens. Let's say they're at a party and you happen to be at the party and you see a shift happens in terms of their energy. Mm-hmm. That's what you pay attention to. You're paying attention to what is not said more than what is said. Because if you ask somebody, how are you doing? More than likely they're going to say, oh, I'm fine, because that's what we've been trained to say. But we need to be able to see what's not being said and be attuned to that. And what I learned most from my clients is what little ones need and how to be attuned to them. And I feel that I give that gift that they gave me to my children, to my partner, and to my friends, as well as my clients.
Wow. Yeah, it seems just so simple and so subtle, but it's huge.
It should be simple.
It's right. It should be simple.
It should be, and it gets so complicated. It gets so complicated. And basically, the Buddhists say, do no harm. And it's just really being present and open and accepting and non-judgmental and available to people. It's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm. Let me just reintroduce you here. I'm speaking with Teresa Gil. She works with women who've been abused. She's also a full professor. Where are you a professor?
I teach at an area college, Hudson Valley Community College.
Okay.
And I've been teaching there for over 25 years.
Okay. So
Everything is over 25 years, but it's really over 30 years.
okay.
Don't count anymore.
I accept that. So what are you doing now? I said in the bio that you've got a private practice. Tell us more about that.
Well, something came up that I'm really grateful for. So right when we went into the pandemic last March, Gabor Mate had a training, and I got an email about his training for compassionate inquiry. And it's a 1-year training, and I took that. And it was the absolute best thing that I did. And the training, you meet twice a week with a mentor and a group of other people who are training. And you get to see Gabor Mate work live, which is exciting.
Wow.
Once a month with clients. There's also question answer periods once a month with Gabor Mate live on Zoom, of course. But the interesting thing, which I think is so vitally important, is that you work with each other. So you learn the skills, but then not only do you meet twice a month with the facilitator in your group, you're supposed to meet with the people in your group weekly and practice compassionate inquiry with one another. And that came in really handy during the pandemic when people were homebound. And I got to meet people from all over the world. I have friends from Hungary and Romania, and a lot of friends from Canada and from the United States and Bosnia, and all of them interested in the same type of healing, where the belief is that where you get stuck as an adult has its roots in childhood, and that the object is to go back to that incident, find out the belief that was formed at that period of time, go back to that child, be able to have a conversation with that child that got stuck in time so that you can move forward. And you do that with the compassionate witnesses of other people.
So that's compassionate inquiry?
Gabor Mate, and he does,
Yeah.
I think he does 2 or 3 a year. And it's very powerful, and I'm loving it. So I finished that last August, but this March I did the mentorship program. So I finished that mentorship program in about 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. So to be a mentor in compassionate inquiry.
Well, no, the mentorship program means you get one-on-one training.
I see. Okay.
So more specifically.
Okay.
Yeah. And they also have internships too, for people to participate in internships, but you have to go through their year program.
Okay. So
that's what I'm doing now.
Okay. Okay. Talk about the people you're working with, your clients, the clientele rather.
I work primarily with women. Like my partner said to me, he said, I would really like you as a therapist, and I would think you were a nice person, but I think as a man, I would want a male therapist, because I think I need a model of what it means to be a positive, empathetic man that works with humans. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So primarily I work with women, and I work individually with women. I used to do groups, but now I work individually. And I use the concept of the child within. And again, the belief, like with Gabor Mate or internal family systems, or even bioenergetics, if somebody is stuck and they're hurting, and no matter what you say to them, they don't have flexibility in their ability to emotionally have movement, or the belief is really stuck, then it probably has its roots in childhood, and that it's important to go back in childhood. And in doing that, you use the body, and you use breath, and you use the right brain for doing visualizations and memory work. Would you like an example?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm working with this one woman. I'll call her Louise. And she comes into my office. She has a long history of pretty severe child abuse and neglect. She comes into me, she's disassociated and really not there. She's learned to be socially appropriate, but there's like a dearth in her face and in her posture. And so she had two brothers, a mother, a father. They were all upstairs and all of them had their own bedrooms. Her bedroom was off the kitchen with a curtain, not even a door. And there was a crib in the room. So she was really on a whole different floor. Her mother couldn't even hear her cry at night.
Mm.
Part of, we found out later on, is that part of the reason why she wasn't given care and she was neglected was because her dad was not her biological father. Her mother had an affair with another man, and she was the product of that relationship. So right from utero, she was not wanted and not accepted. She was sexually abused by both brothers. Her mother never answered her cries. She can remember being 3 years old, crying and crying and crying. Finally, she crawled into a little ball and she stopped crying. She said she knew at that moment she stopped feeling. She would leave the house at 3 and 4 years old for hours and hours and hours at a time, and nobody ever looked for her. She actually found a neighbor 2 blocks away, and she would stare in the fence, watching the neighbor and her daughter play. And sometimes they would invite her in to play also. But she said, I always knew I needed to be good, because if her little daughter took my crayon and I said something, I could be asked to leave. If she pushed me and I complained, I could be asked to leave. So her daughter kind of bullied me, but at least I was connected with people. So one day she comes into therapy after a year and a half of working with her. And she says, I went to the family gathering and I heard the story that they tell every time the family meets on July 4th. It's the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, parents. And she said, it just really pissed me off this time. It just really pissed me off. And she said, I don't know why, but it's supposed to be this endearing little story. And the story is that I loved my mother so much that whenever there were holidays, I would be in the corner rocking back and forth singing, I love my mommy, I love my mommy. So I said to her, would you like to explore that? And she said, yes. So we both got down on the floor and I had her position herself like she was that little girl in the living room at the parties. And I asked her to rock back and forth and sing, I love my mommy. And she started to do that. And she said, I can't do this. And I said, why can't you do this? Because it's too overwhelming. And I said, well, can we take a peek together? And she started again. And the tears started to come down. And she said, I just left my body at the top of my head. And I said, why would somebody want to leave their body? And she said, it's just too painful. So then I said, can we take a peek at this together? And I'll go there with you. And I'll hold your head so that you don't leave your body at the top of your head. So what happened is she started to rock back and forth singing that song. And then she just went into deep tears. And I held her as she cried and encouraged the crying and the tears to come, because those tears have been held in for over 30 years. And those were probably the same tears that her little girl had in the crib when her mother didn't answer her, or her mother didn't even hear her because she was in the room off the kitchen and her parents and brothers were upstairs. So at that point, then there's the feelings, there's the release. And I know some people question, should you go that deep? But it's already there. And it's wants to be heard. And if you go into the body and you have the experience and then afterwards you feel lighter, then that's the sign that you did what you needed to do. And you don't always have every session strong experiences like that, but you need to have the tools to be able to be present for somebody, and to be a witness to that and to help coach them so that they can look at that more deeply. Then afterwards, we're able to look at the little girl. What would that little girl look like sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth? What color was her hair? It was brown. What color were her eyes? They were brown. What was she wearing? She was wearing a dress. And what color was the dress? It was red. And what kind of shoes was she wearing? It was black shoes with tights. And what would you do if you saw that little girl sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth, singing, "I love my mommy"? I said, what would you know about her? She said, I would know that she felt really alone, disconnected. How close could you get to her? I couldn't get too close because she would shrug up and she would shy away. So how close could you get to her? Probably about 5 feet. How would you have to talk to her in order to connect with her? I'd have to use a really low voice. What do you think she needs to hear? She probably needs to hear she's not alone. And what would happen if she heard she was not alone? I could feel her body soften up. And can you make eye contact with her? She won't make eye contact with me. And why won't she make eye contact? Because she doesn't trust. What would you need to do to have her trust? I would have to tell her that I'm here. And what else does she need to know? And she'll tell you what she needs, that I won't leave her alone anymore. Can you promise not to leave her alone? Yes, I can promise that. What happens when you promise that to her? She can make eye contact. Is there any way that you can take her out of that living room and put her in a safe space? And so usually they say yes, and they find a safe space out of that period of time. So she's no longer left there. And at that point, you start to create a relationship when you meet weekly with the client, with that little one. So she can start to have compassion, but it's really herself. It's really a metaphor or a visualization of her. Now, sometimes what happens, which is really interesting, and this is the stuff I didn't know, this is the stuff that happens with clients when you work with them, they teach you, is that sometimes they meet their little one and they hate them. I don't want nothing to do with them. She was the one that caused all my problems. She was the one that, the reason why I got abused, and I can't stand her. And you have to respect that, you know, but then you work slowly so that you build the relationship. One client that I worked with when we did the visualization, all she heard was a voice that said, help, help. And it's interesting because this client also sexually abused, violently abused by her stepfather, was very disconnected from her body. She was overweight. She always wore black. She always wore 3X clothes. And she said to me, she said, when I'm thinner, I actually take up more space and I'm more visible. When I'm overweight, even though I'm in physically more space, I'm less visible. And that's how I protect myself. So in her house, she told me she only has a mirror 12 by 12 inches. So she only sees her head. She's totally disconnected from the rest of her body. So then it's not that hard because what you're doing is you're letting go of ego, your own ego, and you're just following the client's lead. So I asked the client, she's saying, what does she need help with? She needs help because she's lost. And does she want to be found? She wants to be found, but it has to be the right circumstances. So ask her, what are the right circumstances? That she needs to know that she's not going to be abused. And what does she need to hear from you? She needs to hear that I'm there for her. Can you tell her that? No, I can't. Not yet. So then sometimes I'll do something and I'll say, I will tell the little girl that I see her and that I know she's there, and that I'll make sure that the three of us keep in touch with her. And that may be just what we do in that moment. And that is actually a lot. So
Yeah, I want to just kind of wrap up here, but before we do, I just want to say that what you're doing here is incredible. I mean, I know our listeners are like, this is like a master class in the questions, the invitations of exploration. But let's finish this little bit up here, and then we'll close it out here.
So different women come with different little ones. And then it's interesting because over time, like this one woman, she saw her little one was sitting on a couch, looking straight ahead, all black and burnt and charred. Mm. And it was interesting because she was a mom of two, and she was a single mom, and she was struggling with poverty and trying to go to school. And basically, the little one and her image of that child is, I'm burnt. She's burnt. And so we could talk about that and use that metaphor about how burnt she is. She was also angry at her little one. She said, I can't do nothing for her because I feel like she causes me all my troubles. She says stupid things. She's socially inept. She doesn't know how to keep her mouth shut. She just got me in more and more trouble. So she couldn't do anything for her. And she said, even if I go over there and try to touch her, her skin would just come off. But eventually, after like a year or two of working with her, she said, she came into me once. That's why you have to love your clients. She came into me once and she said, I just want to tell you, I saw my little girl and she has skin and she's happy and she was dancing this morning. Yeah. And so the metaphors or the child within can tell you where the person is at internally, emotionally, and it can also show you the growth that they're taking. And the more that they can have insight and awareness and compassion for themselves, the more that they can heal. But with the mothers that I worked with who are survivors, who are struggling with their own children, they said that the most important tool for them to be good mothers to their own children was how the therapist modeled mothering to them. Mm. So Selma Freyberg has this one. Sometimes I'll read a sentence in a book and it will just stop me. And this sentence stopped me. And it said, a mother who hasn't had the cries of her own child be heard is a mother that cannot hear her child's cries.
Mm. What was that book? By
Selma Freyberg. She wrote an article.
Okay, Selma Freyberg. Okay, I wanna wrap up here. Teresa, this is amazing. You are amazing. I'm so glad that we connected, and I've got to have you back because obviously there's a heck of a lot more to talk about. And the way you articulate your experience is so phenomenal for our listeners. I know it. I mean, this is the juice of the podcast, and you're perfect for this podcast. So I want to thank you so much for being here. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
They can go to my website, okay. www.teresagilphd.com.
Okay.
And on the website is my email address, but also my blog on Psychology Today that touches on some of these areas. And also the book that I wrote on mothering survivors.
Okay. And tell us about the book. Where can people get the book?
They can get the book on Amazon.
Okay. Okay. And what's the name of the book?
It's Women Who Are Sexually Abused as Children, Mothering, Resilience, and Protecting the Next Generation.
Okay. And I'll have that link up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. People can go there and get the book as well. Again, fellow New Yorker, I love it. I loved having you on here, sincerely. I mean, this is what this podcast is about, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.